We are looking at the resurrection of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And we're looking at the fact that Paul said Christ was the first fruit out from among the dead. Now, it is more than obvious that Jesus was not the first person to ever be raised physically out of physical death. We could chronicle a long list of individuals that were raised out of biological death. That fact is absolutely undeniable. So what happens? Those who insist that there will yet be a future, quote, physical resurrection say, well, what that really means when it says Christ was the first fruit from the dead, the first to be raised, Acts 26:21 and following, what it really means is that he was the very first person to ever be raised in an incorruptible body that can never die. Well, here's the problem. The Bible nowhere affirms that. Nowhere. This is one of those presumptive, presuppositional arguments. Now, the only text that I'm aware of that has ever been offered in any kind of exegetical attempt to prove that Jesus was raised in an incorruptible, immortal body, here is the resurrection, here is the ascension, and the only argument that I've ever seen set forth is Romans chapter 6, 9, and following, where Paul says the following: Christ, having been raised from the dead, dies no more. Death no longer has dominion over him. Now watch verse 10 and pay very careful attention. For the death that he died, well, everybody knows he died physically. Well, wait a minute. The death that he died to sin once for all. But the life that he lives to God. Oh, wait a minute. Paul's not focused, very obviously, on Jesus' physical death and physical life. Because notice what he does. He draws an absolutely perfect parallel between Jesus' death to sin and life to God and the death and the life of the Romans. Watch this. He then says, likewise, just like Jesus died to sin and was alive to God, likewise also reckon yourselves to be dead indeed to sin. Okay, now wait a minute. If Paul is focused on the physical death of Jesus, then since the Romans are just like Christ, he says, the death that Christ died, he died to sin. Likewise reckon yourselves also, likewise, to be dead to sin. Oh, wait a minute now. The Romans were not dead biologically, were they? Kind of tough to write a letter to physically dead people. So here is Christ who died to sin, alive to God. The Romans, Corinthians as well, but the Romans, dead to sin, alive to God. And the resurrection, by the way, notice the resurrection in Romans chapter 6 that the Corinthians were waiting on is the direct counterpart to the death that they had died. Notice in Romans 6, you were buried with him. Now look, the Greek in this text means you joined with Christ in death. Folks, he makes the point in verse 9 and 10 that he's not talking about the physical death of Jesus. Was the physical death of Jesus that external outward sign? No one's denying that. But he is also saying, and this Greek word, this prefix, meta, is put together here, and he says, We'll start with verse 3 now. Do you not know that as many of you as were baptized into Jesus Christ were baptized into his death? Now watch this. Therefore we were buried with, meta, him, buried with Christ. Well, if the focus is on physical death and physical burial, then since Jesus was physically buried, must have been physically buried in a physical grave. Oh, but wait, he's talking about their baptism. This is not physical life, not physical death, not a physical, quote, burial in physical ground. Therefore, we were buried with him through baptism into death, that just as Christ was raised up from the dead, by the dead, the glory of the Father. Now watch this. Even so we also should walk in newness of life. Paul's focus is on death to sin, alive to God. It is not on physicality. And thus to argue that when Paul says Christ was the first fruit from the dead and appeal to Romans chapter 6, Paul's appeal and discourse in Romans chapter 6 is not on the nature of the physical body of Jesus. It is on his relationship to death and to God. Relationship. Because that's what he says. And number two, because the Romans had entered into death, likewise, reckon yourselves also, just like Christ died to sin, reckon yourselves to be dead to sin. Well, they were not biologically dead. Just like Christ was alive to God, reckon yourselves also to be alive to God. Well, they were physically alive during the entire process. We have to honor what Paul is saying. Paul is not focused on the bodily, i.e. human bodily form and its substance in Romans 6 or 1 Corinthians 15. He is focused on stance. In that he died to sin. In that he lives unto God. We'll see you on the flip side.